Okay, chill.
Oh, everybody can see that?
Yes.
All right. I just want to start off by saying that was awesome. I really enjoyed that. I've read your paper probably about 15 times.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, no, I really have. It's been something I've really enjoyed. Um, so all right. So I'm gonna do my best to try to synthesize what I took from your paper, as well as adding to and providing some different ideas within this space, because I think this space is open for a lot more discussion. And so obviously I'm going to be talking about virtues and having some theology binding into this, because I think ethics and morals matter in many of our conversations in our day-to-day life. So the idea here is to critically evaluate what you've done, draw from Byzantine theology, field theory, and dynamical systems, and then look at some case studies of how this would work, looking at virtue field dynamics, theological cybernetics, and dynamical equations. But really, the main goal in this is I want to point out that governance is not merely an information problem, but is a moral and ethical one. And I'll unpack that because morals and ethics are information, but what that means may lead to some different ideas. Um,
I agree.
all right. All right. So let's look at this. All right, so first off, entropy, right? This leads to systemic order, collapse, or entropy is systemic disorder, collapse, instability. We have a virtue-driven self-organization which stabilizes and sustains institutions over time. That's what I would argue. So from you, we have information is a form of energy or is energy. It's equal, it's equivalent, and it's capable of reducing systemic entropy. But then we have this idea of public policy failure that arises from information suppression, right? So bad governance stems from censorship, disinformation, and a lack of transparency. Then we have these cybernetic feedback loops that help sustain the systemic health, and this helps prevent the collapse of the system. Now, this model does correctly identify the importance of information flow, but the one thing that I want to point to is I think it kind of leads open to the argument of the ontological and moral foundations of governance, because again, policy failure is not simply an information problem, it is a virtue problem.
Yes.
Now, in my dissertation, we look at virtues as foundational energies in public policy. And so, what I argue is that virtues function as true energetic forces that stabilize systemic governance. So, virtues are not abstractions, they are participatory energies that govern our decision making, that shape cognition, and they reinforce resilience in institutions. So, unlike entropy driven models, which seek negentropy through information transparency, uh, with this virtue-based cybernetics, we ensure stability by embedding moral attractors into policy networks. So again, virtues are not just information, but they regulate entropy in governance. And so in this, we have this idea. So we're going to recognize that entropy is a key threat to governance. We're going to highlight the need for cybernetic self-regulation in the political system. And we're going to argue for the role of negentropy in governance sustainability. Now, things that I think lead to issues would be the ontological or the ontology of information. So first, information is relational. It's not fundamental. It does not exist apart from the interpretation and the ethical context. So no matter what the information is, it must be analyzed. Entropy alone does not explain government collapse because institutions fail not just from data suppression, but from moral decay. Information flow must be governed by ethical attractors, not just cybernetic mechanisms. And then when we look at this theological and second order cybernetics, I think we get a deeper dynamic than a purely materialist framing. So let's think about this ontological and moral foundation of governance, right? So I agree that information is energy and that policy failure is fundamentally an information suppression problem. But what we need to think about is the ontological structure of what this means. And so let's think about it this way. Governance is not a feedback system. It is an ontological construction. And if you're curious what I mean, I'm going to be using ontological construction to mean it is a reason of being. So it has its structure, it has its reality prior to information, energy, and material. So if governance isn't just a cybernetic structure of signals and responses, it's a structured reality that embodies those values, meanings, and purposes. So institutions are not machines. They are moral mechanisms and organisms that require a structure prior to the independence of the informational processes. So if we treat governance as a purely informational system that assumes truth and meaning emerge from whatever data flow, but we have to realize that truth and meaning are preconditions for coherent information exchange, and that governance is rooted in a teleological reality, not just in an efficient reality, which goes into this idea of entropy and negentropy, to where there may be something like a lack of the principle of constraint within a government. But information is not substantial for governance. It is an instrument through which government operates. And I think we agree with that on this idea of the process and the functionality. But if information is alone determines what is stable, then an AI-driven state should be the most effective form of governance. But governance requires moral direction, not just the optimization of that data itself. So if a government is ontologically ethical, then the failures would not be explained by entropy, but by moral collapse. And again, we have to assume that bad government emerges from an inadequate or a distorted information set. But history shows a couple examples of governments that had access to information but still failed catastrophically. And this is where we have to start separating sets of information, right? We have the critique from Hayek, where localized information is not going to be able to be used by higher levels of governance, right? This is where Elinor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom started making stuff like polycentric governance, where we actually see that the different levels of being when it comes to these information sets allow for different levels of information to be utilized, and any type of downward expectation on that upward information doesn't work. So we can also realize pretty clearly that information-rich systems still collapse when morality fails. So the Soviet Union had a high information processing capacity. It still collapsed. The government had a massive bureaucratic intelligent operations. It failed due to moral corruption, not because of a lack of data. This corruption, lack of justice, oppression, ideological rigidity, all of these things lead to its political and economic entropy. And so we can look at this and say that information did not prevent collapse, because information was not just an informational, but ethical. And again, when I say ethical, this is prior to information and energy. All right. Now, let's look at some other issues, right? So first thing, when we think about this matter, energy, and information equivalence, I think that this is flawed, right? Because matter is both potent, potential, and active. And so if matter has both potency and actuality, that would be in Aristotelian terms, then matter has the potential to take on any form, but it requires an actualizing principle to bring about its full existence, right? So the matter itself cannot be equal to the information, because the information must be a part of the structuring of the matter itself. So they can't be equal. And so material creation has potential or probabilities, but activity is the actualization of that probability. So again, we separate those, right? Matter itself does not possess any type of self-actualization. It requires an external principle. This would be, if we want to think of it from a teleological perspective in evolution, or from an external principle such as a divine energy, and what I would probably propose from St. Maximus the Confessor, logoi, or a reason of being. And then we have energy and information. These are purely active. They do not exist with any type of potency. They are the actualization or the expression of the thing itself, right? So The activity is the completion of the probability that happens prior to. So all of this leads to a problem of saying that there's an equivalence between matter, energy, and information. They are ontologically, or as moments of being, distinct from one another because matter without energy or without that. Now, I know you point to the level of interdependence, and that's true, but even within interdependent things, they are still distinct within their ordering. Also, when it comes to these systemic feedback issues, something I wanted to talk about more, but I didn't really jump through. When we think about the requisite variety made by Ashby, that's only one piece. There was another cybernetician, Allen, who modified this to bring up the requisite knowledge. So if you have the ability, or if you have all of the variety to interact with all of the variety, if you don't have the knowledge on how to interact with all that variety, you've lost it. And that's exactly what you're pointing to in your work, is that we have to have a way to utilize the amount of information, right? So we have to have knowledge, but I think the knowledge claim is kind of missing within your work. And I think if you add that knowledge piece, I think it works a lot better. Okay, so I'm going to get to my piece. Okay, what are the four main virtues? That's going to be prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. These have been the virtues that everyone has looked at throughout history, right? Prudence, this governs our cognitive structuring and leadership. We've got justice. This is where we establish equilibriums in policy and enforcement. Temperance, this is what regulates stability in socioeconomic structures. And then we have courage. This is what fortifies resilience against those external shocks. So the idea here is that virtue fields stabilize government systems like divine energies stabilize creation because these are movements and they require something anterior to them. All right. So I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with Kurt Lewin. He had a field theory. He was the guy who came up with hodological spaces. It's a really fascinating psychological model based on behavior, personal factors, and environmental factors leading to obviously change. So most governance models are static. They treat policy as a fixed structure. They assume decisions emerge from rational, linear, or bureaucratic processes. For yours, we have this government failure results from information suppression and systemic collapse as a problem of cybernetic inefficiency, again, rather than a moral order. I would argue that because of the dynamic nature of governance, where decisions of systemic stability evolve over time, the role of virtues as forces shape behavior rather than merely guiding rational decision-making processes. And this is a necessity of second-order cybernetics. Now, governance is understood as a force field. This is where virtues act as attractors and entropy generating forces act as repulsors. And so in our decision making, this is not just a rational process, but is a dynamic one. And it's going to be shaped by how an individual relates to an evolving ethical landscape. And so policy failures are where we're losing attraction toward virtue-driven equilibrium, and therefore we could say that the governance should be understood in this dynamic system, that virtue functions as forces that structure the decision-making fields. Okay, so going back to this idea, virtues are not the abstract properties, but they're the realities that influence the individuals and the institutions. And so again, looking at Lewin, we have behavior, B represents behavior, P represents personal factors. So that would be our virtue inclinations and moral developments. And then we have our environment. That's the structure, and those feedback loops are taken into account through that. So governance is stable when policies remain within virtue attractor basins, and policy collapse occurs when decisions deviate from virtue fields, which increase the amount of entropy. And so we would label virtue potential function. This is where V is the virtue potential function energy, or virtue potential energy function governing policy stability. We have our force vector field generated by the virtue-based governance. And then we have this change where this ensures that policy dynamics are pulled toward virtue stabilized equilibrium. And we can see in this that we have this virtue gradient field that pulls towards this ethical stability. And then we're going to look at those network interactions between like political action committees, special interest groups, politicians, and their feedback from also the core constituents in their area. And then we also have this stochastic noise. These could be, obviously economic crises, political instabilities, things that are exogenous shocks to it. And so we really have to understand that the stability conditions for policy resilience are where those virtue potentials create the equilibrium points. And from those, we get the stability only insofar as that condition is satisfied and the policy decisions remain stable within those virtue attractors. Now, we can say that there are weaker virtue-based influences in policy. We can say there's an increased governance disorder. And again, this would lead to all of those issues. Right. But let's wrap this up because I've probably said a lot. I'm closing in on the time. One thing to think about here, Lewin's field theory, this provides this really necessary framework for understanding governance because it models governance as a dynamical system rather than a static system. It's going to capture the force-like nature of virtues and treats them as structuring energies within policy networks. It's going to help us understand theological principles where virtues act as ontological attractors, guiding systems, and that we can look at governance not modeled just as an information processing center, but as a field system where stability is regulated by those ethical attractors. And again, to look at a case study, we can think of the Byzantine Empire. So this is what I would consider a virtue-based governance model. Now, obviously, it wasn't virtue-based the whole time, but it did last over 1,100 years. So this governance structure around these theological virtues, around this conciliatory decision-making processes, even though it was a monarchy, allowed for adaptive governance responding to external pressures while maintaining moral stability. Then we can look at the Soviet Union. This is a case of entropy without virtue. There was not a lack of information, although some would argue a lack of localized information, but the collapse was driven by the ethical decay, the corruption, the ideological rigidity, and the systemic distrust. Now, to wrap this up, I've made this distinction between virtues and information. But the key here is that virtues are information, but they're information that relies on a prior structure, a character on the person. And that's the key to understanding this whole movement here. Oh, go back. Right here. When we actually think about the changes that happen within this dynamic system, where we have these virtues as attractors, this is a part of the internal character and structure of the system itself. And it doesn't matter how much information a system can get, that system, again, due to its autopoietic nature, must internalize, actualize, and analyze that information on its own. So it doesn't matter how much information it gets. If it starts from a bad position, it will stay in a bad position because it does not have the ability to actualize that energy properly. So there must be something anterior to the information, and that would be what kind of information and how that would be processed by the system itself. So to lay out the last piece, information governance is not about the flow, but it's about the ethical stewardship of those in that role.
Okay, great.
Oh, thank you for your view, for your yes. I just want a quick remark before. Yeah, of course, ethics, philosophy. I mean, I'm a business ethicist. I did my master in business ethics. I realize this, but I specifically left it out more or less to concentrate on physics in this.